Do you want to time it?
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks. Okay. So I know when you're ready.
Go.
Okay. So today I'm going to do a little presentation on the fight or flight response, which is as part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. My name is Stephanie Davies, and this is part of the professional practices course for the personal fitness trainer program at NEAT. So I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to imagine a scenario. You're walking to your car after you're done work. It's late at night, it's a large empty parking lot. You hear footsteps coming up behind you. You pick up your pace, so do the footsteps. When you turn over your shoulder and you take a look, you see a tall, hooded figure about 20 feet behind you. I want you to tell me, how would you feel?
I'm scared.
What physiological things would you notice are happening in your body?
My heart would be racing. I'd probably start to sweat. Probably feel like I either have to puke or towards the other end.
Exactly. Okay, so what you're listing are all examples of responses from the fight or flight response. So you'd feel maybe a little bit more alert. Your hearing would be really good. You might start to sweat, increased heart rate, quicker breathing. All of these things are part of the fight or flight response. And what that is your autonomic nervous system responding to a situation that you perceive to be dangerous. So it stimulates tissue metabolism, increases alertness, and prepares your body to deal with an emergency, or what it perceives as an emergency. Another example of this would be if your friend was hiding around a corner and jumped out at you and scared you. You know, like that's another thing. Ooh, you know, get your heart rate up there, make your heart jump a little bit.
Yeah.
It's all the same thing. It's all the fight or flight response. So now that we know what it is, today we'll just talk about what exactly the autonomic nervous system is. We'll talk about the anatomy of the sympathetic system as well as the effects of the sympathetic system. And we'll compare the two major divisions, sympathetic with the parasympathetic, see how they work together, contrast, and then just a couple of examples of syndromes or diseases. So the autonomic nervous system, also known as ANS for short, and what it does is it regulates the physiological systems outside of our awareness. So the body temperature, or coordinating our respiratory or digestive, excretory, and reproductive functions. It adjusts the internal water, the electrolyte, nutrient, and dissolved gas concentrations within the blood and the body fluids. And there's three divisions. There's the sympathetic, which is like the excitation. It's also known as the thoracolumbar division. So that's like the exertion and endangerment response. There's also the parasympathetic division, which is like inhibition. So that's the resting condition, basically, which is also referred to as the craniosacral division. And then we have the lesser known enteric division, which controls digestive functions, and it's kind of controlled by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic together. A little lesser known, still important, but we're not going to focus so much on that one today. So this is what the autonomic nervous system looks like. So this is the parasympathetic over here, sympathetic over here. There's a lot going on in this diagram, but it's just to kind of show you how everything is connected here. So it starts out with a preganglionic neuron, which is usually a visceral motor neuron. The impulse then travels to neurons in a ganglia, either near the spinal cord or near the target organ. And after that, the impulse travels to a postganglionic neuron, which controls the peripheral effectors, like the target organs. So the parasympathetic division, again, just a quick little breakdown here, is the preganglionic neurons to the ganglionic neurons. Now there's two ganglionic neurons that there will be a path to. So either it's going to go to the sympathetic chain ganglion or it's going to go to the collateral ganglion. And then also a major part of it is the specialized neurons that are in the suprarenal gland. So I'll just break it down a little bit. So the first step, the preganglionic neurons. So those are located between the spinal nerves T1 and L2. The cell bodies of the neurons are in the lateral great horns of the spinal cord, and their axons enter the ventral roots of those segments. So after the preganglionic neuron, it goes to a second neuron, which there's one of two paths, like I said. So first we'll look at the sympathetic chain ganglion. It's also called the paravertebral or the lateral ganglion. And it resembles a string of beads, which is why they call it that. It's typically a paired structure. And there's one of three destinations once an impulse enters the sympathetic chain ganglion. So the first one is it's either going to synapse right within the chain ganglion, or second, it's going to ascend or descend within the chain and actually synapse at a different level. Or it will pass right through without synapsing and go on to a collateral ganglion. So basically, when an impulse is traveling through the sympathetic chain ganglion, it's more of a response for activities when you need a sudden and intense burst of energy to protect yourself from a dangerous situation. So specifically the effects, that was kind of a general statement, specifically what ends up happening is it constricts the cutaneous blood vessels and decreases blood flow to the skin and most of the organs in the body wall. It increases the blood flow to the skeletal muscles and to the brain. It stimulates energy production and also use of energy by the skeletal muscle tissue. It releases stored lipids from the cutaneous adipose tissue. Stimulates the excretion by the sweat glands. It also stimulates the erector pili and dilates the pupils for focus on distant objects. It also increases the heart rate and the strength of the cardiac contractions to increase the blood flow throughout the body, and the dilation of the respiratory passages. So all these things are just meant to give you a physiological boost. So if it doesn't go through a sympathetic chain ganglion, where does it go? It goes through the collateral ganglion. So what happens is the fibers will pass right through the chain without synapsing and eventually converge onto the collateral ganglion. They're variable in appearance. They're often single structures. And there's three ganglion. There's a celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, and the inferior mesenteric ganglion. And generally, these ones are more for reducing blood flow and energy use in the visceral organs and releasing stored energy. So it's going to cut back on the blood flow to your digestive system and that kind of stuff. There we go. Okay. So specifically, what are the effects of the collateral ganglion? It reduces the blood flow to the visceral organs. It decreases the digestive organ and the digestive gland activities. It stimulates glucose release from liver reserves. It relaxes smooth muscle in the bladder wall. It reduces the rate of urine production in kidneys and controls some aspects of sexual function. So an example of that would be like male ejaculation. So the sympathetic stimulation. So once stimulated, preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. So that's called I always say this word wrong, the cholinergic synapse. I'm always saying it wrong. So it stimulates the ganglionic neurons to release usually norepinephrine, but some of them also release acetylcholine. So when it's a norepinephrine terminal, it's called an Androgenic. Something about that word. I don't know why. So there's a smaller number of ganglions that release the acetylcholine, but they're still important. Some preganglionic fibers pass through the sympathetic chain and the celiac ganglion without synapsing, and they proceed right to the supraadrenal medulla, which is right in here, in the suprarenal gland. So this performs as more of an endocrine function. So it releases the norepinephrine and epinephrine into the extensive capillaries that surround the adrenal gland, and they act as hormones, so they travel throughout the body and act on different parts of the body in peripheral regions. So it acts more like a hormone than it is a neurotransmitter. But it only affects cells with a alpha or beta receptor, so it's very specific. So this is a lot longer lasting effects because of the time required for the hormones to diffuse throughout the capillaries and throughout the body, whereas when it's in a localized area, it's a lot more short term. So a sympathetic stimulation summary. So the changes from the sympathetic system can be to change the activities of the tissue by releasing norepinephrine or sometimes acetylcholine into peripheral synapses, which has a localized short-term effect, or distributing epinephrine or norepinephrine through the bloodstream, which has the longer-lasting widespread effect. Sympathetic activation is an event that the body goes through when it experiences a crisis and the entire system responds. So you'll have an increased level of alertness. So that's like in that parking lot where you're like tense and you feel alert. And a feeling of energy or euphoria. Increased cardiovascular and respiratory activity. Increased muscle tone, so feeling really tense. And the increased mobilization of energy reserves. And all of these are in combination with the previously listed effects specific to the collateral or the sympathetic chain, depending on where the neurons are synapsing. So that's the sympathetic division and the activation of it. So the parasympathetic division is a little bit different. It's a little bit more of an opposition. So how is it different? The parasympathetic division constricts the pupils, causes secretion of digestive glands and nutrient absorption hormones. It increases the smooth muscle activity, stimulates and coordinates defecation, contracts the bladder during urination, constricts respiratory passages, decreases the heart rate and the contraction force of the heart, and also has a role in sexual arousal and stimulation of sexual glands. So the parasympathetic division is called the rest and repose. So it's completely opposite of the fight or flight. So what happens when something goes wrong with your sympathetic division of your autonomic system? So I just have two examples here. So Raynaud's syndrome. A lot of women in Alberta would be familiar with this one. Always have cold hands, cold feet. So what it is the sympathetic system orders excessive vasoconstriction to the peripheral tissues. So you've had like cold hands, cold feet. It's often in young women and usually in cold temperatures. There's no long-term tissue effects unless it becomes, pretty extreme. Typically, people don't have too much of a problem. Another example is the Horner syndrome. So that is when a post-ganglion innervation to one side of the face is interrupted. So that could be caused by injury, tumor, progressive conditions such as multiple sclerosis. The affected side becomes flushed and the vascular tone, or it becomes flushed with the decrease of vascular tone. And sweating stops on that side of the body. The pupils also become markedly constricted. So there's just some examples of the effects that the sympathetic division can have on just your everyday life when there's problems. So just in conclusion, things we went over, there's 3 divisions to the to the autonomic nervous system. So the parasympathetic, the sympathetic, and the enteric. The sympathetic division has a preganglion, a ganglion, and neurons in the suprarenal gland that are with all their associated effects, depending on where they go and their paths that they take. The sympathetic activation occurs in crisis, and so that is when all of the system responds together. The parasympathetic system often has opposing effects, and then just a couple of clinical conditions that exist from the regular sympathetic function disruptions. Is there any questions?
No.
No?
No, not really. Yes.
All right, well, thank you for listening, and there's the references there for you.
And you had 4 minutes left.